So, welcome to Bangor University, and more specifically, welcome to the College of Natural Sciences, CNS. CNS is made up of three schools: the School of Environment, Natural Resources and Geography, which is where we are; the School of Biological Sciences, which is a few buildings away; and the School of Ocean Sciences, which is across the Menai Strait on Anglesey. The remit of CNS, bringing together these three schools, has been to address issues on a broad range of scales, from genes to landscape, and across a really important critical interface, which is the land-ocean boundary. And to that end, we also collaborate a lot with the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, CEH, which is NERC's only institution in Wales, which is also a few buildings away. And we also have very extensive collaboration with our partners at Aberystwyth University, which is a mere 2.5 hours away via a very twisty mountainous road. And I guess the consortia within NRN are in part a consequence, or maybe just an expression of the joined up science that we actually have in Wales. Clearly, to carry out our research ambitions requires an interdisciplinary approach, a cliche, but true nevertheless. But more importantly, it requires researchers who can move out of their comfort zone and think outside of the box. Which brings me to tonight's speaker. Dr. Andrew Jarvis describes himself as a farmer and/or an academic, which I guess tells us quite a lot about him. He actually began his research career, as a systems biologist working on the regulation of photosynthesis. He subsequently moved into climate science, and in particular on the feedbacks between Earth systems and climate models. And more specifically, he moved on to looking at climate change adaptation and mitigation as an exemplar of the coupling of the natural and social systems. And this has led him to a wider consideration of such couplings in the global concept of energy use, which is what he's really going to be talking about this evening. At the same time, he appears to continue his interest in farming and food security issues. Quite how he melds all this into a unified whole, hopefully, he might be telling us about in his lecture. So it is with great pleasure that I hand over to Dr. Andrew Jarvis.
Whether this is going to attempt to meld my two sides to my personality, I doubt it very much. But it's going to hopefully prick your interest in something that I think you should find very interesting. I'm going to leave this slide up just briefly because it's interesting that we're going to be talking a lot about this stuff. This is carbon. We're going to be talking a lot about energy and where it comes from in the environment. And we're going to be focusing on the role of networks for doing that. Okay. So hopefully you'll have also seen my flyer for this and this wonderful picture. This is Bagger 293. It's the largest land machine in the world. I don't know whether you've seen these things before, but it's a bucket wheel excavator for mining lignite, and this one's in Germany. And why is it relevant to what I want to talk about? Well, the first thing you need to kind of appreciate is that this thing was made using energy, a lot of energy. And what is it doing? It's digging up more energy to make other things that use energy. Okay? And as a result, you can immediately see that these things are the embodiment of a feedback between energy resources and the growth in the use of energy resources. Okay? And I want to focus on that particular issue. My talk, this is a public lecture, but it has some techie bits in it. I'm a bit of a geek, I guess. And so I apologise if I geek out a bit too much, but it's necessary. We're going to need to look at data here in order to infer what global energy use data tells us about this feedback between digging energy up and the things that use the energy we dig up. Okay? In addition to that, this picture is also illustrating another really important thing I want to get over to you, is that this is the beginning of a network that links the environmental resource that it's digging up to you, the end user. And so it goes down this conveyor belt here, so it's being dug up, the bucket wheel's over here, it's a huge thing, comes down a conveyor belt and goes off on another conveyor belt off to a power station that turns into electricity that comes down some cables and ends up in your lives. All right? I want to show you that how these networks are fundamental to regulating the sustained growth of the system that we've observed at least over the last 160 years. I'm just going to have to refer to my notes now and again just to kick me off to make sure we don't forget anything. The perspective I'm going to offer you may seem a little bit odd because I am going to meld together the people involved in running this thing, there's people crawling all over this machine, and the machine itself, and say that they're a system and they cannot be decoupled in the same way that us sat in this room are part of this room. You cannot decouple it. It's our behaviours interacting with the infrastructure that I'm going to call industrial society. Okay? I've already failed a little bit in my introduction because I've meant to have said Marx in the first sentence. And this systems thinking that I'm going to try and get across to you is very much the core of what the kind of things that Marx was doing when he was trying to think about the operation of capitalism. And that's exactly what I'm also going to be doing. I'm going to be applying systems thinking to think about the operation of capitalism. I'm going to do much less in terms of prescribing what we do to change it than he did. He did an awful lot of prescription. And I think that would better, in my experience of giving this talk, come from a discussion with you. I'm going to throw it back to you. If there are implications for what I'm going to show you, then I think we talk them over and think about prescriptions. I'm not going to stand up here and go, and as a result, what we need to do is such and such. Although I will offer some controversial final slides that might kick that discussion off. All right? A lot of people that I've given this talk to in the past, after we go for drinks or whatever we're going to do at the end, come back to me, or they leave the room and don't come back to me, because it's quite dystopian. This is quite a dark thing I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you, because there's coupling between you and technology, the agency that things like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, thinks we have over making decisions over energy policy is an illusion. Here we have the hidden hand of capitalism guiding the dynamic evolution of the world energy system beyond political control. This is markets writ large. All right? I can see already some of you fidgeting in your seats. Okay. Another useful primer for the talk is to think, well, it's the economy, stupid. Why am I doing what I'm going to do? Because I'm going to offer you a completely new and alternative view of what this thing is, industrial society, that does not trade on the standard norms of macroeconomic thinking. Okay? So if you're expecting me to talk about GDP, the only thing I'm going to say about GDP, it's rubbish. It's a rubbish metric. Here are three measures, the three best measures we have of purportedly the same thing, and you can see how poor they are. If I do this for energy, I can show you later. If I did it for different independent measures of global primary energy use, they are nearly identical. Okay? And so there's a rationale. If you want to understand the behavior of industrial society, perhaps we should be thinking about energy as opposed to GDP. I am doing further work to look at the relationship between GDP and energy. I am interested in it. And again, in my closing slide, I'm going to come back to what money is. As liquidity, it's dematerialized resources. But anyway, this is going to be not about standard macroeconomic descriptions of the economy. Bear with me. And I guess the last thing I want to say when I say this about energy is that it's interesting. You talk to economists and energy economists and standard economists, and they are adamant that energy only plays a small role in our lives. If you look at standard production of, on average, stuff, they would say the cost of energy in the production of stuff is about 5%, between 5 and 8%. And as a result, it's not the big deal that other people like myself might say it is. And yet I talk to people in the street, and they have this natural intuition that energy is fundamental to everything we do. Okay? And so I'm kind of asking you to come with me on this journey looking at the world industrial society system from an energy perspective, bringing with you your feeling, your intuition that energy is important. It's much more important than the economists would have us believe. Interestingly, there's been some recent work by Kummel in Germany showing that if you take the standard macroeconomic representations of the way we produce things, and you account for the fact that all the things that we have in the production function are themselves produced using energy, actually the importance of energy in the production of stuff, all the things we're interested in, rises to about 70%. Okay, about 70%. So this is why our emerging discourse on energy is starting to hint at that energy is far more important to us than we've previously believed. Okay, far more important. And if you, of course, talk to a thermodynamicist, they're going to say it's everything, right? Okay, I think that's the end of my notes. Right, so that's enough preamble. I want to start where I started with this research, which is global primary energy use from 1850 to 2010. Okay, that's that line there. That's that line there. And the wiggly line is the data. That's the data that we have on global primary energy use, 160 years worth of it. It's on a log scale, and if you take any data and put it on a log scale and it's a straight line, we're talking exponential. Okay, this is exponential growth. And so it appears in the long run, global primary energy use has grown exponentially at around 2.4% per year for at least 160 years. We'll talk about, you're all thinking about the wiggles and the wobbles, aren't you? When we talk a lot about the wiggles and the wobbles later in the talk, because they're important and very interesting. But the long run average, 2.4% per year. This is emissions of CO2. It only grows at 1.8% per year. That's all our paranoias on climate change are based on this red line, right? The growth in CO2 emissions, growing at 1.8% per year. Interesting to note that all our recent efforts to try and knock it off of that curve have come to naught. And again, I'm going to try and scratch away at why that might be. In fact, that was where my interest lay. Why has the whole United Nations Framework Convention process been singularly unable to redirect global primary energy use and fossil fuel emissions? If this is only growing at 1.8% per year, and this is growing at 2.4% per year, this means, and this has been known for a while, that the global energy portfolio has been decarbonising at minus 0.6% per annum for at least 160 years. Okay, so all the discussions we have on climate change about decarbonising the energy portfolio, we've been doing it for a long time. A long time. And really, my interest started here. What on earth is that? Why have we been systemically decarbonising the global energy portfolio at minus 0.6% per year for 160 years? It's definitely nothing to do with climate change. We were not mindful of climate change back in 1850 and before. This is the transition from wood to coal to oil to gas to nuclear to renewables. So what is that? And it has been called, as work done in EASA in the 80s, and this is the dematerialisation of energy flows. It's the dematerialisation of energy flows. And I agree, this is the dematerialisation of energy flows. but why systemically at this rate? Okay, that's the question to answer. And it turns out in answering that question we find out something weird and interesting about global industrial society. So here I am, I'm cycling along on my bike one day, and as has been rightly introduced, I used to be a systems biologist, okay, and I know my systems biology literature. And I'm cycling along, and then all of a sudden I realise, this is a paper we published in Nature Climate Change, and so in late 2012, after it got published, and cycling along, I realised, what's 1.8 divided by 2.4? What is it? 1.8 divided by 2.4. 18 divided by 24.
1.3. 1.3.
No. 3/4. It's 3/4. Yeah? It's 3/4. Why would I be interested in that? If these are two exponential things and they share 3/4 power scaling, that's called Kleiber's law. Kleiber was a German ecologist, and he observed that across a vast array of organisms, from single cells up to blue whales, there was a 3/4 power scaling between their metabolism and how big they were. Okay? Between their metabolism and how big they were. It took until the 90s and work from the Santa Fe Institute by Jeff West to work out why that was. It was only ever an empirical observation. All the ecologists said it should have been 2/3, a geometric scaling, due to the heat loss from the surface of the bodies of these organisms. And they've never observed it. It was always 3/4. And then Jeff West comes along, and have a look at the back of your hand. You can see what I'm aging now. We get this branching structure, as we do in trees, as we do all over nature. And West points out, this is the optimal fractal pattern for distributing resources in space. And this gives rise to the 3/4 power scaling. Networks. Is society constructed of networks? Should we expect 3/4 power scaling? Absolutely is constructed of networks. Roads, railways, shipping lanes, footpaths, cables, pipelines, train tracks. What do these networks do? They take resources from one place in the environment and they deliver to them to another place in industrial society for end use. They're distribution networks. Bizarrely, they're distributing not just what we would consider physical resource, they're distributing us as well. Okay, to points of end use. I distributed myself on my aging BMW K100 from Exeter to Bangor yesterday in order to be in this space to do something. Okay, and I did that consuming resource, and I moved a lot of mass in order to do that. And this theory, this network theory, says that networks will organize. They will organize themselves in order to use the least possible amount of energy to move the mass that they have to move. That's what they're doing, and that's what your blood system is doing. It's using the least possible amount of energy to take the oxygen from your lungs to where it's needed in the tissues, and so on and so forth. Lymph as well. Alright? Freaky. So now I'm saying that all those networks that we're so familiar with are fundamental to the exponential scaling we're observing between energy use and CO2 emissions, and that 2.4% growth rate as well. Alright? Hopefully you're freaked, but maybe you're not. There's a theory. I said there was one equation. There's the one equation. There's a theory now emerging from work between West, Bannevar, that either then assimilated their work into this form, where the efficiency of moving stuff around inside industrial society using these networks is related to how big the networks are, raised to this weird power term, which is the dimension of the space that the networks are filling, divided by the dimension of the space plus 1. This is the fractal dimension. Okay? This is the fractal dimension that these wonderful networks are exploiting to try and do things as efficiently as possible. Right? And so if the dimension of the space is 3-dimensional, we live in a 3-dimensional world, right? This is 3 divided by 4, and that's where the 3/4 comes from. Alright? We can then have a raging discussion, as I do with all my reviewers, about whether society is a 3-dimensional object or not. They think it's 2-dimensional. They don't live in the world I live in. We're trying to cycle up here, it's hard work, right? So, I'm going to be on this slide for a little bit. I'll try and not bore you too much, but we now need to test this as a hypothesis. We need to do some testing, and we can't just use the data the original global primary energy use and CO2 emissions data. We're going to use different data to test it, right? But let's start off. So this is global primary energy use. It's in log units again. This is CO2 emissions, and here we have the exponential scaling, and there's our 3/4 power scaling. There, that one. Statistically indistinguishable from 3/4. Has done this for 160 years, never budged from it. And this is the decarbonisation. So it's systemically decarbonised at -1/4 power scaling, and that's the thing we have to account for, the systemic decarbonisation. And so the test, what we did, was this. We took global primary energy use from a different source, a different database, and we related it to a measure of what they call global final energy use. That's the energy that's arriving at the final destinations where we're using it. Okay? And so in your body, it's the difference between the energy you eat and the energy arriving in the cells where it's needed, right, where the distribution's kind of finished. In industrial society, it's the energy we dig out of the ground and the stuff that comes out of the plug socket to light a room or warm a room. Okay? And wonderfully, the IEA database enables their estimates of that those energy flows from 1971 to present day. And so this is called final energy. The difference in the final energy that we define, we take their final energy, and they also offer you, they separate out something called transport. They don't think that's to do with distribution. We know that's wrong. Transport's definitely to do with distribution. So we take their final energy, we also factor in the transport, and we end up with this relationship. Final energy, primary energy. Hey presto, the theory says it should be 3/4 power scaling. That's exactly what it is. It's 3/4 power scaling. So we've got independent corroboration that it appears society is evolving as an optimally directed three-dimensional space-filling network. As society gets bigger, that efficiency has to drop because the path lengths are getting longer. You're using more energy to move stuff. So globalization is synonymous with declining efficiency of moving stuff around. It has to be. And here it is. Here's the decline. Here's the efficiency of moving stuff around, and it's declining over time. As we use more energy and we get bigger, it falls, and it falls at -1/4 power scaling. That's exact. It would fall quicker if we didn't work really hard to do the best we can to make the cars as light as needed, not possible, needed at that point in time, and the roads following the right routes, and the plane tracks following the right plane tracks, and the plane wings being as efficient as possible, and all that innovation that goes on. To stop this falling any faster than this is as fast, as slow as we can stop it falling. It's optimal, all right? And the other really important innovation that we do is that as these path lengths increase, we can strip mass out of what we move around. We make it like carbon fibre things and stuff like that. And the one that we were talking about earlier is stripping the carbon out of the fuel carriers, decarbonising the fuel carriers. And so that 160-year decarbonisation is us stripping mass out of stuff as society gets bigger. Does that make sense to you? And so the transition from wood to coal to oil to gas to renewables and nuclear is currently driven just by the requirement to remove mass at the right rate to balance the declining efficiency as globalization takes effect. And so what we end up with is that and this is the prediction, that the decarbonisation rate is linearly proportional to the declining efficiency of the network, and that's a one-to-one scaling on that, and that appears to be the case. If we did nothing about globalisation and these penalties of getting bigger, just as in biology, it would slow growth. It would slow growth down. And that's it. That's why you're the size that you are in adulthood, because you have got to a stage where you're trading off getting any bigger against the cost of moving stuff around inside you. Okay? And so that's called determinate growth in biology. And it's capped your size at approximately, give or take the variance in the room, how big you are. All right? That's what would happen to industrial society if it wasn't clever. And what it does, is that it appears to do other forms of innovation outside this network in order to restore growth back to 2.4%. And where can that innovation occur? How efficiently we dig the resources out of the ground, and how efficiently we use the stuff when it gets to where we want it to be. And so we clearly partition up innovation now. It's innovating on moving our things around, how efficiently we dig stuff out of the ground, and how efficient we are on using it at final point source. We thought that when we went to look at the country scale, because the IEA database allows you to look at the country scale, that when you go and look at the country scale, that we would see we'd see the world in miniature. All right, we'd see the world in miniature. That's not what we saw. It turns out that actually, so the null hypothesis for the world in miniature would be that any particular country that's more developed would have a lower efficiency for its networks than countries that were less developed. That's how it should be. That's what the theory would say. When you look at the data, all the countries have very similar efficiencies. Very similar efficiencies. So for example, we compare the efficiency of Bolivia, which is about 0.45 at moving stuff around. It's nearly identical to the UK, which is also about 0.45 for moving stuff around. Well, that's weird, because Bolivia is not as developed as us. We're smart, right? It just means that we've innovated much more heavily on our networks with regards to dematerialization, etc., in order to try and overcome the penalties. So let's imagine what happens. We've got 200 countries in the world. Let's just take a country and it, by serendipity, becomes able to move resource around more efficiently than any of the other countries. Immediately it would track resource because it's able to move things to points of final use better than anyone else. And then that would cause development, and it pulls it back into the pack again. And that's called a Calder-Hicks equilibrium. And so actually, when you think about it, you would expect the countries of the world to have very similar efficiencies in this system, and that's what we find. Even though there are levels of energy use per unit space here, spans 5 orders of magnitude. So you've got Singapore up here, and you've got Burkina Faso down here. I mean, they are two very different places. But in a globalized market, they're sharing part of this Calder-Hicks equilibrium. Okay, let's try and cement what's going on here then. So here we have some points of end use. Let's call them end users. Let's try and personalize it a little bit just so it doesn't seem too abstract. Points of end use, they're the red blobs. And we have some resources that the global industrial society is not tapped into yet, and some reserves, the grey dots, that it has networked to. Okay? Let's add one. Bang. We now just join that one onto the network. So Bagger 293 scraped a bit more lignite up. Okay? And you can see what's happened is the path length's increased, hasn't it? Overall, for the entire network, the path length has gone up. That's what happens. And so, as we've said, the efficiency of the overall network declines. So that then causes innovation to occur. It's seamless and it happens simultaneously, but innovation is promoted by that increasing path length. And what are those innovations? Well, we change the means of transporting things. We definitely innovate on that a lot. We dematerialize the flows. That's the one we've been discussing with the decarbonisation. And also, interestingly, a really powerful form of innovating on this network is to move the end users around. And we call that urbanisation. So urbanisation is a systemic response to needing to move people from where they're not part of the network to where they're well connected if they want to be part of industrial society. Okay? So we look to China now. These are classic examples where we move people that are off-grid onto the grid so that they can then access the resources efficiently. As I said to you, though, this will cause, if we did nothing more than this, the overall system would stop growing. It has to stop growing because even though we're working really hard to reduce the inefficiencies as best we can, as we get bigger, we can't stop the inefficiencies increasing. And so we have this further upregulation of the efficiency of end use and upregulation of the efficiency of which we dig stuff out of the ground. And the bizarre thing is that we do this exactly at the right rate to balance the declining efficiency of the network. And what does that give us? Constant growth. And this is why we're obsessed with growth. Okay. I'm going to do it for time. I haven't looked at my time. Good. Nearly there. let's talk about the wiggles. The wiggles are really interesting. I'll give you a little bit of a pause from the whole networky stuff, right? So let's talk about the wiggles, because the wiggles are also very interesting. So here again is our global primary energy use. Here's our CO2 emissions. Here's our decarbonisation. But you can see it's wiggling about that constant level of 2.4% for energy use. Okay? So we can estimate what those wiggles are. And here are the estimates of the growth rate wiggles. So we're taking the 2.4%. We're looking at the wobbles around the 2.4%. So here's 2.4%. And the black line is how the growth rate is changing over time. I don't know whether by eye you would infer what I inferred, but I looked and think, but that might be useful to do a frequency analysis of this. Perhaps there's some systematic structure to the wobbles, all right? And so we do a frequency analysis, and what do we find? There's a fundamental, this is statistically tested as well, right? This isn't just fortuitous and done with 2 different methods. There is a fundamental wobble at 60 years. Kondratiev, you ever heard of him? He was right. So Kondratiev, he was a Russian dude in the 20s, and he was looking at pig iron prices. And he wrote a report for Stalin saying, it appears that capitalism has fundamental processes beyond political control. Stalin didn't like the idea that there were things beyond political control, and so what did he do to Kondratiev? He sent him away to die. Which is really, and as a result, in posthumous recognition of his work, we call them Kondratiev cycles, or long waves. These things are the hidden hand. This is forces at play shaping industrial society that are way off the geopolitical radar. Okay? Not only do we get a Kondratiev cycle. Oh, by the way, so where are we in the Kondratiev cycle? So the 60s were a peak, the 30s were a minimum, the 90s were a minimum, the next peak will 2020-ish. So you might want to be thinking about investing in the right long put options on energy stocks for that. Okay? Not only do we get the fundamental frequency at 60, though, we get the harmonics. Here we get some harmonics kicking in. They're better illustrated when we look at them estimated with a more prescribed estimator for the harmonics. And these harmonics are what the economists call business cycles. Interestingly, the economists don't think these exist. Most of the mainstream neoclassical economists say long waves don't exist. It's fiction. It is fiction when you look in rubbish data like GDP, but if you look in good quality data like global energy use, it's not fiction. Long waves exist. And these are the business cycles we're used to, the ups and downs in the global economy. They're harmonics of the long wave. So now we want to think about why would then this occur? Well, if we're interested in this network and this optimal behavior, this thing's trying to find that optimal, and it can't find that optimal very easily because it's a really difficult problem. How do I optimally connect 7 billion people to of heterogeneously distributed primary resources? Wildly complicated. And so this is a search. I'm positing that as a theory. This is a search as we try and look around the optimum to find the optimum. Another thing we can do, once you've done the frequency analysis, you can back out what you might call endogenous, part of the cycles, from exogenous shocks to the system that have nothing to do with this system. Okay? And what are the shocks? Well, the Second World War, First World War, that didn't appear to be very big shocks at all. The big shocks, Yom Kippur War, well, that's a restriction on oil supply due to a religious scrap in the Middle East. The Iranian Revolution, that was another big one, another restriction on oil supply. Okay? Interestingly, this is controversial, so beat me up later, 2008-9, systemic. Nobody dropping the ball. The alignment of waves in terms of global primary energy use. But the fiscal stimulus, pouring trillions of dollars to try and refloat the baby, that's exogenous. That's humans looking to see the behaviour of the system and saying, actually, we'll intervene. Okay? And so that's why it's positive. If you were anything like my reviewers, you would be up in arms about the three-dimensional nature of the thing that I've just characterised. Is society a three-dimensional object or not? We could have a long discussion about that, save it for drinks afterwards. I think it is, and the data seems to support the fact that it is, but most economists think it's two-dimensional. There's reasons to argue both ways, but I think there's quite convincing reasons to think that it's three-dimensional, but a weird shape. Okay, society's a weird shape. What I really want to just drill into now and then think about as I close out is this 2.4%. This number 2.4% ish. In that area of 2.4%. What on earth could that be? But it turns out you can form a really simple model when you take the discussions I've been positing so far. You bring them together to form a really simple model. And this simple model, if you try and optimize it with regards to the amount of energy you use, it tells you that you can fundamentally link 2.4% to the time frame over which you make decisions about energy. Right? Time frame over which you make decisions about energy. And that fundamental link is just 1 over 2.4%. It turns out the inverse of 2.4%. The inverse of 2.4%, it's not actually approximately 40 years. It's a bit Douglas Adams this. It is 42 years. So
2.4 is 42 backwards.
But
2.4 is
it is as well, but also 1 over 2.4 is 42. Okay, kind of weird, right? Why is that significant? So you then have to come up with another theory that we're still working to test as to why might this 40 years be interesting. Well, for a start, we know it's the average lifetime of all major power projects. So when you design power projects, it's about the lifetime you're planning for, on average. It's the average lifetime of all technology, it turns out. Yes, a tweet lasts a nanosecond, and an ancient monastery lasts an awful lot longer than that. But if you look at the average of all technology, it's around 40 years. Okay, but most importantly, it's the working lifetime of humans. And that, even though life expectancy's gone up significantly over the last 160 years, working lifetimes hasn't. It's stayed around 40 years. So we used to work and die. Now we work and retire in developed parts of the system. Why is that interesting? Because that's the only timescale over which you can affect decisions over the evolution of this system. When you work. Before you work and after you work, you're not affecting the evolution of the system. You might be living off the proceeds, but you're not affecting the evolution of the system. Again, that's a theory. Park that one with you. There's another discussion we can have about it now. Within that framework, you can show why waste is necessary. So there we are, like Dex madly running around trying to implement energy efficiency improvements to reduce energy use, And you can show why in this system, actually, this is why it's a very difficult thing to do. It's very hard to get people to implement innovation on energy efficiency improvements over and above the systemic rate. That just also touches on a very interesting point that the exponentiality, this 2.4%, indicates that rebound is an understatement. Backfire is ubiquitous. So 60% of UK energy policy on reducing emissions is about increasing energy efficiency. This whole system grows because of increasing energy efficiency. And so if you increase the energy efficiency, you promote the growth. And in the future, your energy use will be higher, not lower. So it's Jevons, classic Jevons. All right? So that's a wildly naive stance for the UK government to take. Backfire and rebound are ubiquitous, and it's very easy to show that. Okay, 2 speculative slides to polish up, just to get some discussion going. And there's a big discussion going on at the moment about where did the Anthropocene start? What was the beginning of the Anthropocene, and what was the spark that lit the Industrial Revolution? There are lots of narratives out there about what that spark that lit the Industrial Revolution was, and they might all be true. It's a complex system with emergent phenomena, so they could all be true. But I'm going to give you one particular one that I think is a great candidate. Money is liquefied asset. It's dematerialized liquefied asset. It enables the system to invest in the right parts of the system to evolve optimally. And to do that, I need to glean and garner resource from anywhere in the system so I can exploit all the degrees of freedom to grow in the right places to keep the show on the road. All right? To do that, that resource flow from everywhere in the system to where it's needed needs to be completely dematerialized. I can't physically move all the concrete and everything from everywhere to where it's needed. That'd be silly. So I need to move some form of dematerialized resource. What's that called? That's called money. It's liquefied asset. All right? What you then also need is that you need that money to chase the right projects. It has to chase the right projects in order to keep the growth going. How can it chase the right projects? By speculating and backing the right horses. The problem is, and this is where I might concede to the economist, there's this asymmetric risk thing where the lender has a much bigger risk than the borrower. Okay? As a result, if you want that asset to go to the right place, you have to charge interest. That's what you do. And it can be proved that growth rates in a system are fundamentally linked to the interest rates you charge on capital for that system. Okay? Up until this guy came along, it was illegal to charge interest. You went to hell for charging interest, and there was laws banning it. Church-backed laws banning it. This guy is Mr. Selfish, 2 fingers up to the Catholic Church, because he's more important than the wider religious system he's operating in, because he wants to do his own thing. 1545, he lifts the ban on charging usury. Prior to that, it had been at very low levels, mainly facilitated by the Jewish community in Europe. Okay? He comes along, bans it. Bans the ban, lifts it. But he only lifts the cap to 10%. He lifts the cap to 10%, so you could charge usury at 10%. 10% is not enough to do the really speculative shit you need to do to get the growth going, alright? But it's enough to get everybody used to the idea that you won't go to hell. In 1712, my dates might be out by a year or two, I'm not a historian. In 1712, they lift the 10% cap, and you can charge usury at any rate. And that's exactly the time when Sovry and Newcomen built the first steam engine. And that was a wildly speculative project. Okay? So the cap came off. We start to use exogenous energy sources to build machines that then release energy to build machines, to release energy to build them. We're off. We're exponential. 2.4%. Okay? And so here's a little bit on prescription. Here's me getting a little bit Marxist, I guess, just to finish off. So this is some work I've been doing quite recently with a colleague at Lancaster, an anthropologist, and he's been studying tribes in Liberia. He's interested in dark earth soils. Have you heard about these dark earth soils? And so these dark earth soils are just like we get in England. I think you should study the English ones myself. You don't need to go to Liberia to study it. You look at old backyard gardens in lots of places. The soils are very, very organic matter rich and black. Okay, because all the night soil used to go out onto it, as well as all the vegetable matter and so on and so forth. Turns out these soils are very fertile. That's why everybody's really interested in them. You build fertility and you store carbon. But in these systems, they know that their soils are really fertile, and that the practice of putting crop residue and char and poo on these spaces increases fertility way above the background fertility of the natural soils, which are really low. They're rubbish soils where these people live. So they know this is an innovation that increases productivity. But they do not capitalise. They deliberately forego on the opportunity to realise the benefits of that innovation by spreading it out. Instead, they pile it up, and the soils end up 2 metres deep. They only need to be this deep to have the same fertility. They pile it up. Why? Because the site, this is the village, the site is circumscribed by sacred forest. They do not allow the network to grow. Why? Because the sacred forest is inhabited by the ancestors. So they forego on the innovation in salute to their ancestors and in reverence to their ancestors. And so we came up with this, I did, this redefinition of Brundtland. You've heard of the Brundtland definition of sustainability. It's the meet the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations to meet their own needs. And these guys are doing it different. They're actually passing resource backwards. And be careful with the future generations one, because that might well be as selfish as straight-on capitalism anyway, because that's about feathering your own kith and kin, right? But passing it backwards, that's lunacy in our calculus. But hey, they've learnt to live in equilibrium. Their systems haven't grown for 300-400 years as a result. Now we might argue that they've stagnated at too low a level because they don't have a health service and so on and so forth. But you can see by restricting the growth of the network, hereby by some weird thing, you then restrict growth. Okay, and perhaps us 1%ers in Western Europe need to be thinking about that kind of stuff. Perhaps. Lots of people I've been talking to that have helped me significantly, in particular Nick and Steve, who I wrote the papers with, but also all these guys, and I'm done.